The lesson from this video is that it is not just about the conclusion. What I mean is, if you are having trouble with weaken questions or other argument-based questions in logical reasoning where you're trying to figure out what's wrong with the argument, if all that you do is think about why the conclusion is false, or which of these answers, if true, is going to help me argue against the conclusion, if that's the extent of how you think about weaken questions, then there's going to be a lot of problems where it's really hard to recognize why the correct answer is correct and why certain wrong answers are wrong. Now, I know that this is counterintuitive because when you're first starting off studying logical reasoning, everyone tells you, and I agree, that you should be very focused on the conclusion, and that's because most people start off not being precise enough about what the conclusion means and not focusing enough on the conclusion. But as you get better at the test, and as you start to have difficulty with the difficult weaken questions, the hard weaken questions, even if you're very good at the other ones, then your issue might be that you're not focused on the premise as much as you need to be. And that's because weakening an argument is not really about weakening the conclusion or about trying to show that the conclusion is false. What weakening an argument is really about is weakening the link from the premises to the conclusion. The author believes that the premises they gave you are enough to prove the conclusion by themselves, and your job is to show here's why those premises don't automatically lead to the conclusion. So to help you understand this concept, we're going to look at some examples today, and I want to start with a pair of arguments where the conclusion is exactly the same. The premises, however, are similar, but not exactly the same. And what you will see is that because the premises are different from each other, even though they seem very similar, certain answers are going to be correct in one example or incorrect in another example. They're going to weaken one of the arguments, but they're not going to weaken. They're going to be irrelevant to the other argument. So right now you're seeing two example arguments. The first argument says people who sit with poor posture tend to have back pain at a higher rate than people who don't sit with poor posture. Thus, sitting with poor posture increases the risk of back pain. The second one says most people who sit with poor posture tend to have back pain. Thus, sitting with poor posture increases the risk of back pain. So the exact same conclusion you see, but the evidence is a little bit different. So can you think about this? Is this statement down here a weakener? Most people who sit without poor posture tend to have back pain. What's the effect of that answer on example argument number 1 and example argument number 2? And keep in mind, the effect can be different. Well, here's the answer. This is a weakener to argument number 2, but it is irrelevant to argument number 1. It is not a weakener for number 1. It is a weakener for number 2, and here is why. When you look at argument number 1, notice that the premise part, it says that people with poor posture have a higher rate of back pain than the people who are sitting without poor posture. So that's already giving us a correlation between sitting with poor posture and having back pain. So if you happen to learn that most people who sit without poor posture tend to have back pain, and that means over half of the people who sit without poor posture with regular or good posture tend to have back pain, that doesn't affect the idea that the ones who do sit with poor posture are still going to be higher. And here's the visual in case it helps. What that answer is saying is that the group of people with not poor posture, most of them are going to have back pain, so let's just say 60% will have the back pain. But the premise already established that the people with the poor posture, they're going to be higher than 60% here. So let's say it's 65%. And what the author is saying is, look, there's a difference. This group gets back pain at a higher rate. And so that's why I think the way that they're sitting is contributing to getting back pain. It doesn't matter what exact percentage we're talking about, right? The poor posture people, it could be 90%. It could be almost every single person who sits with regular posture has back pain. Well, the premise was establishing that for this group, it's going to be higher. Maybe it's 99%. So that's why the answer does not weaken the first argument. But when we look at the second argument here, the second argument is not establishing in the premise that there's a correlation between sitting with poor posture and back pain. All it says is that most people who sit with poor posture, so over half, tend to have back pain. But we have no reason right now to think that that fact is any different for the people who don't sit with poor posture. The author seems to be thinking that there's some significance to this fact, that there's a higher rate of back pain in the people who sit with poor posture. But example argument number 2 doesn't actually establish that. And so that's why this answer, which says most people who sit without poor posture also have back pain, would show that right now we have no reason to think that there's anything particularly special about poor posture when it comes to back pain. And this answer is actually showing there's no correlation between sitting with poor posture and the rate of back pain. Let's take a look at another example. And the argument on the left here says, John Wick is a popular series of violent action movies. Since it's a popular movie series, a novelization of it will be a financial success. Example number 4 says, since John Wick is a popular series of violent action movies, a novelization of it will be a financial success. What is the impact of this answer? Is it a weakener on argument 3 or 4 or both? Some novelizations of popular romance movies set in Victorian England were not financial successes. Think about that for a moment. And here's the answer. This answer choice weakens argument number 3, the argument on the left, but it does not weaken argument number 4. Now, here is the critical reason why. It depends on what is a premise, all right? In argument number 3, do you notice that the actual reason given for the conclusion for why a book version of John Wick is going to be a financial success, the reason is the since, because it's a popular movie series. The first sentence is just a description of what John Wick is about. It is a popular series of violent action movies, but the violent aspect of the movie is not one of the reasons the author thinks the book is going to be a financial success. But in example number 4, the violent aspect is part of the reasoning. And so that makes a really big difference. The reason it makes such a big difference is because the argument in number 4 is making a much more limited assumption. The author isn't saying that if it's a popular series, the book version will be a financial success. They're saying if it's a popular series and also a violent action movie, that's what means it will be a financial success if turned into a book. So if you try to come back at them with some example of a totally different genre that wasn't a financial success, the author would say, I wasn't talking about that kind of movie. I was talking about violent action movies, and it's the violent action aspect of it combined with its popularity that leads to my conclusion. That's why this does not weaken argument number 4. But in argument number 3, the violent action aspect of John Wick was just a description, and so it wasn't being offered as a reason. That means it's not part of the core assumption of the argument. The argument in number 3 really was saying, if popular movie, then book becomes financial success. So any kind of counterexample, even if it's about a totally different genre, will weaken argument number 3. So I hope I've been able to show you that you cannot just focus on the conclusion of the argument. If you're trying to weaken an argument, you can't just think, which of these helps me prove the conclusion false? Which of these helps me argue against the conclusion? That is so limiting and will really only work for easier, average difficulty problems. But for many of the more difficult ones, you absolutely need to understand what the premises are and what's not a premise. And you also have to think about what the premise means and what's the author's interpretation of the premise. Why do they think that premise leads to that conclusion? That's the key question.